The land that became a nation, a story of America. The first dawn, land and people. Long before the word United States was ever spoken, there existed vast lands of sweeping plains, mighty rivers, dense forests, and towering mountains. Long before Europeans set foot on this continent, countless indigenous peoples lived, thrived, and built civilizations shaped by deep connection to the earth. In the hills near the great Mississippi River, the Mississippian culture flourished around what we now know as Cahokia, a city of earth and mounds, bustling trade, and powerful leaders. Its people watched the seasons turn, trading with neighboring tribes, telling stories of the spirits that walk the riverbanks. Among the Iroquois Confederacy in the northeast lived Owanorako, a young woman whose eyes reflected the dawn. She listened to the elders as they spoke of the great binding law, a set of principles meant to unite tribes in peace and strength. It was here, long before European sails hung on the horizon, that the first seeds of unity were planted in this land. Their stories were etched into stone, sung around fires, and remembered in the movements of the stars. Across the continent, the land breathed with life, elk on the plains, salmon running up northern rivers, corn ripening under golden sun. These were sacred gifts, not resources to be owned but blessings to be shared. 2. Winds of change, arrival of new worlds. In the year 1492, the winds shifted. Across the storm-beaten Atlantic, Spanish ships creaked under the sun. Christopher Columbus, sailing for distant monarchs, never knew how far his journey would stretch. What he called the New World was already old with history, rich with civilizations and knowledge that Europeans barely imagined. Stories spread across the continent like wildfire. Rumors of vast lands beyond the sea stirred both hope and hunger in the hearts of monarchs. England, France, and Spain competed to claim foreign shores, each dreaming of wealth and glory. In the southeast, the Powhatan tribes watched strange white sails glide into Chesapeake Bay, their crews clad in iron and cloth unlike anything seen before. To the west, the French explored dense forests and mighty rivers, trading for furs with tribes whose languages sang like rivers in spring. With trade came disease, smallpox, measles, and unfamiliar fevers that ravaged indigenous communities that had lived in balance for centuries. The old ways trembled under the weight of this invisible storm, and whole towns stood empty where laughter and song had once flourished. Still, the people endured. They adapted, they remembered. Owanoroko's descendants carried stories of resilience, even as the winds of change battered their world. 3. Seeds of a new nation, colonies and revolt. By the early 1600s, England had planted colonies along the eastern coast of North America. Jamestown rose first, a settlement born of ambition and survival. Men huddled in fortified palisades, struggling against hunger, heat, and unfamiliar lands. As winter came, their lives hung by thread, but they endured through knowledge shared by the land's original peoples. Not far north, pilgrims in Plymouth planted corn beside their wooden shelters, praying for a harsh winter to end. Their arrival was less conquest and more desperate hope for freedom from old wars, old systems, old boundaries. As decades passed, English colonies multiplied, each with its own character, Virginia with tobacco fields that bent under the sun, New England with towns of merchants and fishermen, the middle colonies where fields of wheat rippled under breezes. By 1770, these colonies had become fertile grounds not just for crops, but for ideas. Enlightenment thinkers spoke of rights, of liberty, of governments formed with the consent of the governed. Samuel Adams shouted in Boston Commons. Thomas Paine's pamphlets traveled from hand to hand, igniting fires of courage and defiance. The British king, far across the ocean, saw colonies as sources of revenue. Taxes without representation stoked resentment. In towns and taverns, men and women whispered of something radical, self-rule. The Boston Tea Party struck like thunder. Crates of tea plunged into cold water, symbols of rebellion that could not be ignored. Battles erupted at Lexington and Concord. Minutemen stood trembling in early morning fog, rifles raised against the world's greatest empire. George Washington, a tall Virginian with steady eyes, took command of ragged troops. They were farmers, not soldiers, but they fought with a fire that surprised the world. The Declaration of Independence, penned by Thomas Jefferson, was more than ink on parchment. It declared a bold truth, that all people are created equal and born with rights no monarch could take away. Against all odds, the Continental Army endured. Valley Forge tested their resolve. Frozen toes and hunger could not break their spirit. When French ships appeared off the American coast, under Admiral de Grasse, hope rekindled. At Yorktown in 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered, and the dream of independence became impossible to deny. IV. Forging a republic, trials and triumphs. The war's end was only the beginning. A new nation struggled under the Articles of Confederation, a loose alliance that proved too weak to bind the states in peace. Debates erupted over how to create a government that was strong enough to unite yet limited enough to protect liberty. In a hot, crowded room in Philadelphia, delegates wrote a constitution. James Madison recorded the debates, fierce, passionate, often uncertain. Would the president be too powerful? Would larger states overshadow smaller ones? Through compromise, ingenuity, and sheer will, they shaped a lasting framework. The Bill of Rights followed, 10 vital protections that guaranteed freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and due process. These words were a promise that the new republic would protect the individual against tyranny. But not all were granted full rights. Enslaved Africans labored in fields of cotton and tobacco, their families torn apart, their voices suppressed. Indigenous peoples saw their homelands shrink as settlers pushed west, claiming land with little regard for treaties or ancient heritage. Still, the nation marched onward. Roads expanded, rivers teemed with steamboats, and the telegraph shrieked messages across wires. Expansion and conflict, the 19th century. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the nation's size overnight. Vast grasslands, forests, and rivers became part of the expanding republic. Explorers Lewis and Clark traced the Missouri River to the Pacific, their journals filled with wonder at mountains, prairies, and canyon lands. But expansion came at a cost. Native nations were pushed from ancestral lands. The Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole faced forced removals, marches of sorrow that would become known as the Trail of Tears. Meanwhile, the question of slavery's expansion ignited fierce debate. In new territories, would slavery be allowed? Missouri's admission as a slave state nearly tore Congress apart, prompting a fragile compromise. Kansas turned violent, neighbors fighting neighbors, giving the territory the name Bleeding Kansas. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln's election, based on preventing slavery's spread, triggered secession. 11 Southern states declared independence from the Union. Civil war erupted at Fort Sumter. Brother fought brother. Battlefields such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg stained the earth with blood. Lincoln, a humble lawyer with steady resolve, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the war's purpose shifting toward ending slavery. In 1865, the Confederacy surrendered. The nation was saved, and slavery abolished. But Reconstruction that followed would be strained and uneven. Freed blacks faced violent resistance and discrimination, even as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments promised equality before the law. The frontier beckoned pioneers, miners, settlers, railroads carving iron paths across plains. Cities grew with factories and immigrants seeking opportunity. The nation was changing fast: steel, oil, electricity, symbols of new power and promise. The modern era, world wars and transformation. The 20th century arrived with triumph and turmoil. In 1917, America entered World War I, helping turn the tide against empires that threatened Europe's balance. By war's end, President Woodrow Wilson dreamed of a League of Nations, a union to prevent future wars. But peace proved elusive. The Roaring Twenties gave way to the Great Depression, stock markets crashed, banks failed, and millions lost homes and hope. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal brought relief and recovery. Programs built roads, homes, and parks. There was work again, pride again. Yet across oceans, shadows of war grew darker. World War II engulfed the globe. Pearl Harbor's surprise attack in 1941 thrust the United States fully into combat. Soldiers fought in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. On beaches stormed under deadly fire and skies filled with roaring engines, American courage burned bright. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, in the Pacific, after Japan's surrender in September. The world had changed. 7. Cold War and Civil Rights. After the war, the United States and Soviet Union stood as rival superpowers, their competition known as the Cold War. Nuclear weapons cast long shadows. The Korean War fought in Asia, Vietnam War divided opinion at home, and space became a new frontier. In 1969, Apollo 11 landed humans on the moon. Neil Armstrong's footstep became a symbol of human daring. One small step, he said, for man, one giant leap for mankind. At home, the struggle for civil rights reshaped the nation. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. marched for justice, winning laws that ended segregation and expanded voting rights. Their words, "I have a dream," echoed across generations. 8. Into the 21st century, challenges and hope. The new century brought new trials. Terror attacks on September 11, 2001, hollowed skyscrapers and scarred a nation. Yet communities, diverse, resilient, came together. American troops served in distant lands. Technology exploded. The internet knitted people across continents. Social movements spread through screens and voices once unheard found global platforms. Through it all, the United States continued its story, complex, imperfect, and always evolving. Epilogue: a living legacy. What began as a dream of liberty became a story of trials and triumphs. From indigenous cultures who first named the rivers and mountains, to the founders who forged a republic, to millions who shaped its society, each chapter mattered. This land remains a tapestry woven of courage, conflict, innovation, and hope, a nation whose story is far from finished.